and welcome to Just Plain Wrong, the podcast where three Mennonite librarians chat about what the media gets right and wrong about the Amish and other plain groups. This week, we will be discussing a book with a Mennonite protagonist, Too Many Crooks Spoil the Broth, a Pennsylvania Dutch mystery with recipes, published in 1993, and the first in a series of food pun-titled mysteries by Tamar Myers. Side note, if you get really into this series, the 22nd book in this series is due out in May, so lots of books to choose from. And we chose this thanks to an anonymous listener who left us a review on iTunes suggesting we cover this series. So thank you to you, anonymous reviewer. So before we jump in, we're going to go a little bit of a different direction with our opening question this week because this book revolves around hunting season. So I don't really think any of us are avid hunters. Maybe one of you will surprise me. But let's talk about deer. Everyone in the Midwest has a deer story. So Abby, what's yours?
I do live in the Midwest and I do have a deer story. It's not a particularly unusual in that it was, car plus deer equals bad time for all involved. But the one note of interest with this was that it was with my friend Steph, been up at the Boundary Waters in Minnesota at the camp called Wilderness Wind, and we participated in their annual fundraiser called the Paddle-a-thon, where we had paddled 31 miles in our canoe. And it was an intense day, but really amazing, really great day. And then the next day we were set to drive home. So it was Steph and myself and another one of our friends in the car. And Steph was driving, and I think we were in Wisconsin, and we were on a highway, and it was that intense, like thunk. And it was, oh, wow. We were fine, but I think the car ended up being totaled. It was Steph's car, and I'm not sure about all the details. But basically, we ended up having to get towed, spend a night there. And this was all I was only a year or two out of college. So this was probably one of my first experiences with any kind of car accident like that. So we were all very lucky. No one was hurt. It was a little bit traumatic and did not want to drive at night or in the evening for a long time.
I don't really have any experiences with living deer besides seeing them, but I did grow up on a farm and with parents who thought that skulls of all sorts were very artistic. So we had them around the house, and particularly in my dad's office, we had like a cow skull and a goat skull and a deer skull, and I think at one point a squirrel or a cat skull, and my brother had a jaguar skull that he acquired from some auction. We had a lot of skulls around the house. And my brother did find part of a deer skeleton in a field once. And so he brought the bones home and bleached them and then strung them up with wire. And they were just hung in his bedroom for a while. And then he gave them to me, and I took them to college and hung them on my wall to freak everybody out. I was like, this is normal. Deer vertebrae are really, aesthetically interesting. Why are you freaking out? Please don't leave. So I kept them at college for a while, and then eventually I gave them to somebody. I was done. I honestly don't remember who has them now. So that's pretty much my deer stories.
This is really where I want this story to become another version of the sourdough one, and I want Aaron to jump in and be like, deer vertebrae? I have your deer vertebrae in my back room. But alas, I have a feeling that is not the case.
I wouldn't be too surprised if I get a note from a college roommate or something. It's like, oh yeah, you gave them to me, and then I gave them to my mother, and then she gave them to her aunt, and turns out they're still in Goshen.
My first thought was actually like, oh, you guys are like Mennonite goths.
Oh, it's certainly a little bit morbid, but I definitely didn't view them as morbid until probably high school or college, when other people were like, it's weird that you have a skull in your house. I was like, no, it's not. They look really cool. Everybody has skeletons. Didn't you know that? Have you ever tried drawing a skeleton? Because my mom's an art teacher, and she'll make you do that.
It's just other families keep their skeletons in the closet. Mm-hmm. like good little Mennonites.
Like good Mennonites, indeed.
Well, I don't know if there's any topping Tilly's skull collecting stories, but this happened to me when I was in high school. My immediate family, no one hunts, so I don't have a lot of experience with with, like Tilly, I did not grow up with skulls just around, or deer carcasses, which is what this story is about. So if you're squeamish, you might want to fast forward through this. But it was high school. I think I was a junior maybe. And I was going over to my friend Katie's house, and we were going to go up to Iowa City. And she was like, I need to tell my dad where we're going. I followed her into their outbuilding. She may have warned me, but it wouldn't have mattered because I did not know what I was going to see. And what I saw was a group of, I think, 15 or so men who had returned from a hunting trip, and they were processing the meat, and there were just carcasses hanging from the ceiling in various states of skinned and half skinned. And then there was this assembly line of men, and they were just like hacking at this meat with these giant cleavers. And I didn't become a vegetarian that day, but I'm pretty sure that day it was one of the first seeds towards my journey to becoming a vegetarian, because it's seared into my brain.
Yeah, I think skulls and skeletons are a lot more sanitary than the carcass.
So into our book, which has nothing nearly so graphic, just references about hunting, but no skulls or carcasses. So our book is about Magdalena, who goes by Mags. So Magdalena, Mags Yoder, is a Mennonite woman who runs an Amish-themed bed and breakfast in the fictional town of Hernia, Pennsylvania, with help from her neighbors, an Amish couple who help with cooking and animals, and her divorced and troubled sister, Susanna. Guests at the inn have to apply in advance, commit to staying a full week, and are expected to clean their own rooms and help cook if asked. Our book takes place the first week of deer hunting season in Pennsylvania, and despite the apparently vigorous application process, Mags ends up with a troubling guest situation. 3 are politically connected and there to hunt, while 4 are members of an animal rights group aiming to stop the hunt from occurring, and 1 is a reporter. Conflict between these groups emerges immediately, but then takes an unexpected turn when the reporter is found dead at the bottom of the stairs. A couple days later, another member of the animal rights group is found dead underneath Mags's mother's Dresden plate quilt, much to Mag's dismay. In typical mystery fashion, everyone has a convoluted backstory that, when revealed, makes them a potential suspect. But in the end, the culprit is revealed to be Billy D., a handsome man who arrived as part of the animal rights group, but was secretly working against them the whole time. So any plot points that you need to mention?
One thing it might be helpful to know just as backstory is that Mags runs the inn. Was the farm that she grew up on, but her parents died. And so instead of living a life on the farm, she transitions into running an inn.
So our first question, this is our first book with a Mennonite protagonist versus Amish. And when we read books about Amish characters, and when they describe a character as Amish, it's pretty clear to us what they're talking about. They're referring to Old Order Amish. And while there's some variation between groups of Old Order Amish, they're also pretty similar in terms of dress. They drive buggies, they don't have electricity, etc. So when we just say that someone is Mennonite, things are a bit more complicated, as that can encompass any number of denominations. So for example, the 3 of us would fit best into Mennonite Church USA. We don't wear coverings. We have fairly progressive religious beliefs, and you probably wouldn't know we are Mennonite unless we brought it up in conversation or if you recognized the last name Yoder. But there are a whole bunch of other groups that are considered Mennonite, ranging from Old Order Mennonites who live and look a lot like the Amish, to conservative Mennonites who drive cars and just wear smaller head coverings. And then there's those of us who are virtually indistinguishable from the English. So there's just, if you want to Google Mennonite denominations, you'll get a sense for just how wide a swath the word Mennonite can cover. And yeah, so there's just a lot. And Too Many Crooks, our book for this week, never specifies what kind of Mennonite Magdalena is, which leaves up to us, the reader, to determine that. So I'm just curious what you guys decided about Magdalena's religious denomination. And did it change as you read the book? Did you think she was one thing and then discover she was something else?
The book never really gives a good description of what Max wears, but I get the sense that it's long-sleeve dresses. She says that she looks, quote, distinctly Mennonite. So I'm thinking plain clothes, probably a head covering. We know that she speaks German, that we don't know what dialect. We know that she is familiar with Amish hymns because her mother taught them to her. which suggests that her family maybe had been Amish and then left for a Mennonite church within the last couple of generations. So pretty much what I just ended up going was just like conservative Mennonite. Didn't really go any narrower than that.
Yeah, I had a similar sense of kind of general conservative. I think a lot of the clues in terms of how her outlook on life, she definitely doesn't see a whole lot of options for herself. Like I think she was going to just stay on the farm with her parents for the rest of her life because she never gets married. So yeah, I would say conservative Mennonite of some form. I did think it was interesting. I don't know if we're going to get into this more later, but the author herself was raised in a Mennonite family. So her parents served as missionaries to the Congo. So she clearly is, I think, coming from a more conservative Mennonite. And I'll go into this a little more later, but it was a little harder to piece together too, because this was written in the early 90s. So obviously that probably impacts things too.
Well, I'll be honest. I looked at the cover of this book and it's like full of bright colors. And I knew the author was Mennonite. And as Abby already mentioned, we often Google when authors make these claims. And for once, this author actually had very clear claims. So yay. Anyway, I look at the cover and it's brightly colored and it looks just like any other mystery novel. So I went in sort of expecting like a me kind of Mennonite. And now I'm sort of curious what that book would look like. Like, what would a detective novel be with a Mennonite Church USA type protagonist? Would it actually be any different than any other detective book out there? But anyway, yes, it became really clear fairly early on in the book that she was one of the more conservative groups. A lot of the stuff that Tilly mentioned really jumped out to me. So I wasn't sure quite where to put her. Maybe not quite beachy Amish, but maybe somewhere in that area. So beachy Amish would pretty much look Amish, but they drive cars, usually black cars. So that was my guess. This book relied on a lot of stereotypes, some of which were not particularly flattering, even if they may be, kind of true. Yeah, I don't know if either of you want to talk about one of the characters or some of the stereotypes you saw portrayed in this book.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the presentation of Mennonites in particular, but also the Amish. Because Mags, as a narrator, she's sort of no holds barred narrator. She doesn't always verbalize the things she's thinking to the people in the story, but we hear her think them. And she's thinks a lot of judgmental things, sometimes outright unkind. I was grateful that most of her thoughts weren't voiced, but it was still uncomfortable to sit with her criticism. And it gave her a bit of a holier than thou attitude. And there are threads of truth in that. I mean, it's hard to look at any one individual and decide what a group of people should be like, but I do think that Mennonites probably have a tendency to be kind of righteously pious at the worst, and authentically humble at the other end. And you can get judginess there. So I had a bit of a hard time trying to distinguish between Mags as an unreliable narrator and a sort of just an unlikable character, and Mags as someone who was representative of Mennonites as a group. I didn't really come to any great conclusions.
It was fascinating, and I feel like to a certain extent, not to be harsh, Mennonites can be a bit of an insider thing, and there can be this sense of, well, what we do, what it takes to save money, and if it's at the expense of some outsiders, that's okay. And the whole like public versus private kind of concept with Mennonites, like she is clearly like at one point she's pretending to be Amish, like she actually adopts a Amish accent and then quickly drops it when she realizes that she doesn't need to do it with the particular characters. That reminds me a little bit of, there's that joke or something about how if you're going fishing and you bring 2 Mennonites, they won't drink any of your beer. but if you bring one Mennonite, they'll drink all your beer. And I felt like there was an element of how kind of Mags plays on that a little bit, this whole idea of like, well, if it's free, of course I'm going to take all of it. So I don't know. I will say that felt authentic probably to some of the not so great parts of my own experience as a Mennonite. But the point I did want to talk about a little bit was one thing I was kind of fascinated by is Mags is clearly, she's very smart. In fact, she tells a story about her childhood, about getting some IQ test or something and being like essentially a genius. Interestingly enough, even her sister, who she is always lambasting, is also very smart. But she never considers doing anything with that. She has this keen intelligence and keen wit that is kind of, I think, not being put much to use. Like her plan is essentially was to stay on a farm, and now she runs an inn. I'm not quite, what's the word? It's like I feel like this is sometimes when smart people aren't given an outlet for that and are really limited, a lot of that can come across as superiority. Like if you aren't given a chance to actually engage your intellect and try new things and to dig into that, you can end up kind of a little bit bitter. And that's definitely how Mags came across to me.
I want to talk a little about Susanna, the younger sister, I believe 10 years younger than Mags. So in her early 30s, also lost her parents, but has dealt with the trauma in a very different way than Mags. Basically, I don't think Susanna would consider herself Mennonite anymore. I don't know. We don't get into all that in the book, but she doesn't dress plainly. She, heaven forbid, marries a Presbyterian, and then even worse in the eyes of Mags, gets a divorce. And now she lives with Mags at the inn, and she is known to go out with men and drink and just do all of these things. And her dress is described as very flamboyant. And I really didn't appreciate the way that Susanna was described, mostly by Mags in this book, as just this like incompetent and I don't know. But I mean, there's a sort of idea, I think, in playing groups of this slippery slope, where if you start to allow one thing, then all of a sudden, like, what else will be allowed in 2 years? So that's why we have these strict rules in some of these groups. And I feel like Susanna is clearly like this extreme example of everything bad that could possibly happen to you should you start down this path. First, you marry a Presbyterian. Next thing you know, you're shacking up with someone at a dive bar in your small town. Like, and it just... I didn't like it because Susanna never really got to voice her own opinions about anything. And as Abby mentioned, like she's also very smart. Her IQ, for some reason, is also mentioned in this book. But really, we don't see any of that. And I don't know. I kind of hope that in future books, she gets a little bit of a character development arc. So from there, we're going to shift into our routine questions about accuracy and inaccuracy. So, Abby.
Well, connecting to what you were just talking about, that was something that definitely kind of struck me. This was, would have been written in the early 90s. So I feel like it has a lot of the kind of judgmental purity culture that was very alive and well at that time. I feel like there's also some issues there where Mags and Susanna have issues as sisters that complicate things for sure. But the way that Mags is so harsh with Susanna and just considers her very sexually amoral. And it is very clear that she's coming from a place of it's kind of sexuality is an all or nothing. And it can, once it's lost, you just you lose so much of your worth. And that is really clear in the way that Mags depicts that. And it's also interesting because Mags is very much the opposite. Like, and again, this kind of gets into some of the sister dynamics, but I was fascinated by this idea of like Mags has little to no experience. She doesn't talk about that a whole lot, but then she has a sister, and it's really clear that she is also judging her probably from a place of her own insecurities. Purity culture has not done a lot of good things, I think, to Mennonites and other cultures similar to that. And I think it has been a detrimental thing in a lot of ways. So I feel like some of the bad parts about that were unfortunately kind of accurate. Other things that were accurate, like there was a lot of quilt talk at various points. And while I am not a quilt expert, it did feel like that had some accuracy there. I did feel like there was truth to this idea that the author has a Mennonite background and brought that knowledge into this story. It felt right in ways that I have rarely found, I think, so far in our reading.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, I would agree too. I think even though the depictions aren't always pleasant, or, they don't always reflect well on Mennonites or Amish, more broadly speaking, they definitely, the whole book gets an ambiance that some of the other books we've read really just don't quite manage. And to that point, one of the things that I thought was particularly accurate about this book, at least in my own experience, is that Mags places a pretty much moral emphasis on being industrious and being clean. And that is definitely run true in my experience with Mennonites. There's an emphasis. I mean, like if you look at the phrase "cleanliness is next to godliness," then the inverse of that is that like slovenliness is of the devil. And Max even says at one point that she could deal with a sinful, sexy Susanna, but that slothfulness and slobbiness is too much to bear. And I don't know that I've ever had any of, my family or my church community, explicitly say, that slothfulness is sinful. But there's a definite emphasis on being industrious and being clean and being an effective worker. And that the emphasis to the point where it comes off as like a morally correct thing to be. So if you aren't a person who is particularly industrious or clean or tidy, someone like Susanna, then it equates to a moral failing. There's probably some of my own insecurities there that I felt that. So I thought that was kind of an accurate attitude. And I think that, like you were saying, Abby, some of the judgments that Max was making about Susanna's behavior and about the behavior of the English guests that she has, and really about everyone that she saw, were rooted or are rooted in fairly believable behaviors and thought patterns. So I think she's kind of her time and of her community, and it doesn't, maybe she's taken it to an extreme, but it made sense for her character, I think. No, I didn't like it.
One thing I noticed, and this is not anything nearly as deep as the two of you were talking about, is that she gives a little Amish family history that I was like, oh, I know that story. So she talks about the Hostetler family, Jacob Hostetler, who immigrated, this is directly from the book actually, immigrated to America from Switzerland in 1738. In fact, about 80% of all Amish are somehow related through this one man, as are heaps of Mennonites. I am one of those people connected to this family. And because Tilly and I are third or fourth cousins, we think Tilly probably is too. But I definitely am. So that this was in there, I was kind of like, oh, nice little shout out. And later in the book, she also references the Hostetler massacre, which is a whole kind of terrible story involving Amish and Native American relations that we should probably read a whole book on to discuss someday. But that she even mentioned it, I was like, okay, she knows her history here about these groups and what they might think to mention to outsiders, because those are the sorts of stories that we tell.
Going off of that, I also noticed that there were several times in the book where she would talk about a side character, like the deputy sheriff or someone who goes to her church or the guy who runs the grocery store who's her third cousin once removed, and she does identify these people by their relation to her and by their relation to other people in the community. So there's this constant metric like, oh, my mom's fourth cousin twice removed happens to be, the person running the grocery store, and he doesn't give me the family discount, and she's kind of upset about that. And then, time goes on and there's another character, and that's the son of the woman who does the cooking. So there's this constant awareness of how everyone is connected to you, even if it's a little bit more distant. And that is totally something that happens in a Mennonite community.
Very accurate. Very accurate.
All right, so shifting into our list of inaccuracies.
Yes, there were definitely some inaccuracies in this. One thing that did feel a little inaccurate. Now, again, this was set 30 years ago, so maybe this is the way that bed and breakfasts worked 30 years ago, but Meg's is very clear that this B&B is immensely popular and that people have to apply, which seems odd. And then they book for a whole week, despite it sounds like normally only staying for a couple of days. And my favorite part, and honestly, I don't know if this is inaccurate, but I did kind of just think this was hilarious, was this idea that she has sold the inn as the Amish place to stay and has somehow, Tom Sawyered her way into getting her guests to doing the cleaning and the cooking, which honestly, I don't know if that's, I feel like that it's a little hard to believe that guests would do that. But at the same time, it does fit this idea that Mennonites would kind of just look down on people who don't know the difference between Mennonites and Amish and would 100% take advantage of it. So that felt accurate. The immense popularity of the inn and the kind of extreme measures that she can go to run it seemed a little bit inaccurate.
Yeah, I was pretty up in the air about whether or not the inn would be successful. It sort of made sense for Mag's personality to find a way to charge her patrons for every service that they did or did not do. So if you do the cleaning yourself, you still get charged, and if you don't do the cleaning, then you get charged a little more.
I just realized it's Tom Sawyer plus the innkeepers from Les Miserables.
Oh, it totally is. Extra for the fleas.
Extra for the mice, 2% for looking in the mirror twice, Anyways.
As far as inaccuracies go, I thought I didn't catch too many individual things. I was vaguely annoyed by the fact that Mags mentioned that she has a quilt up for people to work on, guests to work on, usually women, and that if the men want to do something, they can husk corn. So she keeps a basket of unhusked corn in the living room. And since this book is set in September, which is the first week of deer hunting, yes, I did look this up, I think it's unlikely that she would have sweet corn available to put in a basket, and why she would leave it out all day instead of just husking it and freezing it or canning it or doing something with it. I don't know. But the farm kid in me was like, do not treat your sweet corn like that.
Would it be field corn?
My understanding is that most Amish and conservative Mennonite groups that harvest corn do it with the old school corn harvesters that pull it off the stalk and actually husk it, but don't pull the kernels from the cob. Yeah. So, I guess hypothetically, she could have a garden with corn and she could want people to grow field corn to feed chickens or something, but I doubt it. Going back to, I feel like all of the accuracies that I found in this book are sort of vague, atmospheric, and internal, just feelings that it feels right. And I feel like the inaccuracies are also just sort of feelings. One of the things I did notice is that Mags and Doc, another Mennonite character who's a vet, are a little bit blasé in their references to violence and their willingness to consider violence against others. And that could just be their personal flaws, because we already do know that Mags is a hypocrite. So this could just be one more way in this hypocrisy. But Mags says something like she's personally repulsed by the idea of shooting anything that isn't trying to mug you. And the vet, Doc, says that there's a woman who deserves to fry until she's a nice golden brown. And both of these imply that it's okay for people to be hurt or killed if they did something wrong. And that just, it is against every fiber of my being to say that anyone should be physically hurt or killed, even if they did something wrong. So that rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't think that would be something that these characters would have been taught to think. but who knows?
Like in other episodes, what I've decided to talk about isn't necessarily an inaccuracy, more as much as something that just kind of bothered me. A group of the characters are animal rights activists. And because of that, many of them, not shockingly, are vegetarians and vegans and have other dietary preferences that they admittedly don't necessarily, extend a lot of grace to this Amish inn and the keepers of it and the people cooking for them when it comes to their dietary preferences. But the dietary preferences were throughout the book just treated as a complete joke. Even food allergies at certain points were considered like just eat what we're going to give you. And as a vegetarian, this rubbed me the wrong way. I don't feel like it's that hard if you're running a restaurant to, offer something to your guests, and particularly with food allergies, like that's not something that you should mess around with. That said, I will say, as a vegetarian in the Midwest who has had to eat at many an Amish restaurant, I am prepared to have to make sacrifices for my beliefs, because Amish restaurants are not known for their vegetarian offerings. They're known for their delicious carbs and fat-filled and often meat-filled meals. And so, I feel a little bit for the bed and breakfast owners and the Amish chef that they're trying to accommodate these things. But I didn't like that it was all treated as a big joke.
Yeah, not only treated as a joke, but repeatedly treated as a joke too. Overly emphasized.
Yeah, like that was kind of my my beef, the puns here. Make the joke once. I get make fun of the hippie from the city or the pretentious person from the city who doesn't want to eat the meat, but then leave it alone. So the plot of this book is a little convoluted, but it also, to me, I read a lot of mysteries. It also felt sort of like a classic mystery. It even reminded me a little bit of the Agatha Christie mystery, Murder on the Orient Express. We have this group of supposedly strangers that end up in a confined location, and then people start dying, and then as the mystery unravels, we learn that the characters are not actually strangers, and they all have these convoluted backstories that give them all a motive. So I guess I'm just curious your thoughts on how this read as a mystery. Were you surprised by who the bad guy was?
I did not pinpoint it. I enjoyed it. Let's put it that way. I enjoyed it, but I think I could kind of see a number of different suspects. And so I was just kind of surprised when it was like, oh, that one, when it was revealed. I did want to just kind of echo that. I enjoyed the mystery of this. I felt, I guess this is only the second mystery that we've read so far, but this one felt significantly like up several levels, let's put it that way, in terms of plotting and kind of, revealing different backstory and weaving together interesting things and presenting characters with a number of motives. Some of them were believable, some of them less so. I did end up finding a little bit of Billy D, the killer's motives, to be a little bit convoluted. I felt that was a little forced.
Yeah, it took me until probably 3/4 of the way through to pinpoint Billy D as the murderer. That was after the second death. There are 2 murders and 2 poisonings by 2 different poisoners, just to keep things interesting. I was a little thrown in part because I pegged Billy D as a love interest at the beginning, and I thought, oh, this is going to be the catalyst for Mags to do some self-reflecting, and she's going to be less judgmental of her sister because she's going to fall in love with someone who's not Mennonite or Amish. And maybe that was just wishful thinking on my part. So Billy D eventually did become a suspect character, in part because he was out for revenge, and this is very much a premeditated murder. And at one point he even said something like, I considered, not doing this, but I'd committed. And I do find premeditated murders less believable in general in any narrative. I'm statistically, I'm aware that most, homicides are crimes of passion and things that happen in the heat of the moment. So I think that someone wanting revenge for himself for being in prison for accidentally shooting his own daughter and then infiltrating this animal rights group while still eating meat. Like, I don't know why they didn't suspect him of something weird, but it also just seemed like such a low level thing. Like, it's just like, so someone who has been harmed by one person is basically infiltrating the equivalent of like a social club, a social justice organization, very small one, for the express purpose of killing this person down the line.
Yeah, for me, the big clue was something you mentioned. Like when he was revealed to be part of the animal protective group, but he was all like, give me the bacon. I was like, you're suspicious. All right, so let's review this book, and we're going to go on a scale of 1 to 5 vegan Amish casseroles, which feels a bit like an oxymoron. Though there is a great Instagram account, Vegan More with Less. So, hey, if you're a listener of this podcast and you want to try and whip up a vegan Amish casserole for us, let us know. So, Abby, we'll start with you.
So I ended up enjoying this book a little more than I necessarily expected to. And I think that has a couple of reasons. One, it was pretty lighthearted. There was a lot of humor, some of which worked for me and some of which didn't, but it was enjoyable. And it ended up being kind of a fun mystery. And I think it was just also a nice change of pace from some of the romance that we read. And I also don't know if it was partly because this is the first in a series and we have I don't know whether it's a bad habit, but it's definitely a frequent thing that we do where we end up reading a book like in the middle of a series. So it was kind of nice to have the like origin book. Given that I actually think I would like to read another book in this series, and I don't know whether I'll actually get to it this year or anytime, but I want to read more about Mags. Especially I want to see if her character develops and where she goes with maybe hopefully a little emotional growth, maybe. Let's put it that way. So I'm actually going to give this 4 out of 5 vegan Amish casseroles. I enjoyed it and I want to read more of it. So that's better than some other books that we've read.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I follow the same rating scale there. I think 4 out of 5 Amish vegan casseroles or vegan Amish casseroles. I'm not sure which modifier should come first. I was compelled by the story throughout the whole time. I wasn't always happy about the characters' attitudes, but I did feel that Mags in particular, we kind of know from the get-go that she's an abrasive and kind of unreliable narrator. Like, one of the first things she says is that she's more upset by the fact that someone has died and their bowels have loosened and it might be harming her mother's Dresden plate quilt. And we know that she cares more about the cleanliness of this quilt than she does about the fact that someone has died in her inn. She's very upfront about it. And I don't know if it was just that I wanted to see character growth from her, or that I was just interested in a character with such strong opinions, which, you know, after a lot of romance novels that we've read where I think the characters are a little bit more subdued and definitely more likable, I thought that having someone who was unlikable and whose way of thinking wasn't always pleasant leaves a lot of room for character growth, and I want to see what happens. I hope she mellows out a little. I hope she becomes a bit more forgiving towards her sister. I want her to travel the world like she wants to travel the world. So yeah, I enjoyed this one.
I'm going to go 3 vegan Amish casseroles. I found it a nice, enjoyable read, but there were just so many cringy moments that I feel like I need to ding it a little bit. That said, I do agree, especially I think it was Abby who was saying she wants to read more. And I do too, in part because, like you both have mentioned, I kind of want to see how Magdalena and Susanna grow as characters, like nowhere to go but up. They were both kind of immensely unlikable in this book. Also, I am a big sucker for puns, and the titles of these books in the series. So here's some of them, some of my favorites. The Crepes of Wrath, As the World Churns, or perhaps my favorite, Butter Safe Than Sorry. And I'm gonna have to read some of those just to see what happens.
Yeah, a pun for every book in a 22 book series is no mean feat.
I did want to just get another quick Mennonite moment in here. My cousin messaged me and she said, "Hey, Abby, I just wanted to share with you that I was talking to my friend Laura the other day, and I told her that my cousin has a podcast called Just Plain Wrong and that she should listen to it." And she said, "Hey, that's my cousin's podcast." Turns out she's cousins with Aaron. So not quite sourdough, but I love that.
So that wraps up this week's conversation on Too Many Crooks Spoil the Broth. Feel free to let us know your thoughts. You can reach us at Plain Wrong Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, or plainwrongpod@gmail.com.